Welcome to the Researching Practice, Introducing the Theory of Practice Architectures podcast. My name is Máirín Glenn, and I'm here with the originator of the Theory of Practice Architectures, Stephen Kemmis. So this is episode 9 of this series of podcasts, and it is entitled Action Research and the Theory of Practice Architectures. And so, Stephen, before we get started, we left episode eight on a bit of a cliffhanger, insofar as you can ever build a cliffhanger into educational theory. And so you were trying to convince me and our audience that changing practices change practice architectures. And I'm still waiting to be persuaded, to be honest.
Well, I'm having to persuade you in this episode, Máirín, but you'll have to be as skeptical as you can. Because I'm going to address it directly. But the question about to what extent our practices can change practice architectures, we can change practice architectures ourselves. Sometimes the answer is we can, and sometimes we can't. But we'll come to that. So, will we begin?
Okay, sounds good to me.
So here we are, action research and the theory of practice architectures. And last time, the question that was left hanging was if changing practices requires changing the practice architectures that hold them in place, and that changing practice architectures requires changing the arrangements that compose them, can people change arrangements? And the answer is they can change some, but not the others, not others. So it's easy enough to change some things in the room, if you're a teacher, for example, but some teachers are not able to control the weather. So there are some things that are beyond the control of people, but we can change some things, but not other things. And the question is whether we can change enough things to make new practices possible, but also changing things can cause issues for people. Will I press on, Máirín?
Yeah, I'm happy so far. Yes, please.
Now, we're talking about action research in the practice and the theory of practice architectures this evening, or it's my evening, this session. So action research is people individually and collectively changing their own practices, their understandings of their practices, and the conditions under which their practices are carried out. And that view of what action research is goes back quite a long way. But it'll become slightly more complicated. On the right, that lovely spiral staircase is the spiral of self-reflection. And so when you're doing action research, you plan a change to your practice and you want to see what happens. So you put the plan into operation and then you observe what happens. And you reflect on whether it worked or happened the way you expected or things need to be done differently. And then you replan, I'll do it differently next time. And then you put that plan into operation, observe, reflect, replan, and so on. And so that spiral of self-reflection is about people thinking about how things are going. And this is really an important, to me, the spiral of self-reflection, which doesn't always happen perfectly in the right order or whatever. Things go, and often when you replan, you think I'll start with something else. I'll make a different change this time. I won't try to do what I did last time. That didn't seem to go very well. But the spiral of self-reflection is just a kind of way of thinking, of planning what you're going to do, acting on it. observing, collecting some evidence about what happened, and reflecting. And our book that outlines how these things happen is the Action Research Planner from 2014 that I did with Robin McTaggart and Rhonda Nixon. And in that book, when we're talking about doing critical participatory action research, in particular, we wanted to talk about a new view of participation. Participation is the people who are wanting to do the action research project together. A new view of action, thinking about practice using the theory of practice architectures, and a sort of new view of research, which is not getting so hung up on all of that information that we have from positivist empiricist research, and trying to think about research the way we did in the episode where we talked about traditions in the study of practice. That is, thinking about the evidence that you've been able to collect and how it makes you think differently about what to do next. There are other good books on this topic, Máirín.
Oh. yeah, that's a good, nice book too. Yeah, I agree.
But it's so much more recent.
Yes, it's brand new. Yes.
And I think this is also a terrific guide for teachers doing research in the classroom. And so I think people are right to be dipping into that book as well. Red hot from Routledge. Go out and buy your copy.
Thank you for the plug, Stephen. But I'm not going to be softened. I've just two quick questions about what you were saying just in that previous slide. My first question is about your spiral staircase. Yes, this one. I'm not very fond of that, and I'll tell you why. I think it kind of lends people to the impression, it gives the impression that self-reflection is a nice, neat, take a step and then go on to the next step. Whereas in my own experience of it is that it's a pretty, not as nice and neat and one step after the other. I think it's a bit too tidy.
I think you're right.
Okay.
I think it is very organic, and things don't happen in that sort of order. But the point of spelling it out like that is just to say, don't forget to work out what you want to do and be clear, and to the extent you can be explicit about what you're trying to do differently. Then put it into practice, and then collect some evidence about what happens. Observe to see what happens. Don't just, it might be that you just write some notes afterwards or whatever. But, and then, observing and reflecting just go together really. And then trying to do, well, can I do still better the next time? But it doesn't always happen as neatly as that. And at the beginning, in particular, at the beginning of an action research initiative, I think, you often start out by thinking you'll do one thing and then it turns into another. It becomes clear that that one didn't quite work.
Okay, I'm happy with that. And my second question is, we're assuming that people want to do action research. So why would people in your book want to do action research?
That's a good question. I am a bit addicted to it myself. Whenever I want to, when I'm working with people, I very often want to reflect with them about how things are going. And I think it takes all sorts of forms. Sometimes it's just talk. Sometimes it's just talking together and thinking what's happening. Sometimes it's more rigorous in terms of collecting data. And we'll have examples of different kinds of things like that in this session. But I think people want to reflect on their own practice, not only to change and improve their practices and their understandings of what they're doing and the conditions under which their practices are carried out, a bit like the practice architectures which enable and constrain their practices. Because we want to, as it were, act well in the world. And this idea that goes back to the ancient Greeks of praxis, doing the right thing, the good for humankind, in today's terms, the good for the community of life on earth. If you want to do the right thing, as it were, in those terms, that history-making action, then I think you need to be self-conscious, or self-conscious, not quite, but self-aware, self-reflective about whether you're having the effects that you think you have, or whether your actions are having effects that you're not expecting, don't notice, unintended consequences, and so on. So I think, for Plato, the unexamined life is not worth living. But I think people do want to reflect on and examine their own lives. And I personally, especially when I was teaching with others, I just really enjoyed working with others, inquiring into my practice, our practice together.
I can see. So there's this intent towards improvement or enhancement of one's own life, and also the life of others built into it.
Absolutely. And I think, to talk about is my conduct okay? Are the consequences of my conduct okay? Am I doing things that are unreasonable? Am I doing things that are unproductive, unsustainable? Am I doing things that are inhumane, unjust, undemocratic? When I start thinking about whether my practice has those consequences, then I think I'd like to do things differently. We'll come back to that a bit more.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Stephen.
Well, we'll skip over these books. And the question is, can people construct new arrangements, new practice architectures to support their new and emerging practices? And I think people want to think about using different languages and discourses in which to understand their practices. And in their practice, they may say things differently, think things differently. And so can they do that? So in the Action Research Planner, one of the examples that runs through that is a Canadian high school, Braxton High School. And the students are asked if the students want to do something that's a kind of world-changing initiative. So they decide to start by introducing a recycling initiative in the school. And so they're thinking about reducing waste and improving the possibilities of reusing waste from the school. So they're wanting to think about green ways of doing things in the school. But they also want to change their work and activities. They want to do things differently. So, for example, they get recycling bins and put them around the school. These recycling bins are laid out, and students stand beside these 3 recycling bins. And when other students at lunchtime come up and want to throw their rubbish away, they say, that goes in this one because, that one goes in this one because. And so they explain to the other students, you've got to separate these and put them in the right bins. So people start to do things differently. But they've created the different bins, and they've been pointing to where you put that and that and that. And then they change the social relationships. They got some money from the school to introduce this project, to buy the bins, and they worked with the assistance of a teacher and the principal to introduce this project. And they've changed their relationships. They're now standing beside the bins, telling their fellow students, please put that in there, please put that in there, and so on. And they're trying to change the ways they relate to each other. And they've changed these social relationships. Somebody had been left out of these plans, and the students, to their horror, discovered that the school janitor went round and picked up all the bins and put them into the same skip to be taken away.
Oh,
All
disaster.
rubbish that had been separated was
Mm.
now recombined. So the students were absolutely horrified, and they had to have a meeting with the janitor and the caretaker and the principal and so on, saying, how do we do this? And so they realized they'd left that guy out and they needed to change their social relationships with him. And then things began to change. So you can see they were changing the kind of way they thought. They were changing the kind of work that they did, the activities they did about dealing with waste. And they changed their relationships with other students. And they hoped with the world, you know, they were doing things that were going to be better for humankind and for the world. And they changed their relationship with the caretaker. Anyway, so you can, are you beginning to see how the arrangements, the practice architectures are being changed in this case, Máirín?
I can see that very clearly. I think, though, in this case, that bunch of students had been given a special power or a status or something in the school. You know, it wasn't just a random, oh, let's get together and tell the people that they're going to put their stuff in the bins. You know, there was some kind of a pre-planning thing in it, and they were given some kind of a power to go around and tell everybody what they were to do with their rubbish and so on and so forth. Would I be right?
You're right. There was, across the whole of their school district, Rhonda Nixon at that time was running a project on school transformation. And so she was going to each school and finding groups of students who wanted to transform the school. And so this was a group of students who were in an environmental science type class, and they wanted to work together to make these changes. And they wanted to contribute to making their town, their city, a better place by doing recycling and introducing a recycling initiative in the school. And so they got, I've forgotten how much money, I think it was something like 5,000 or 7,000 Canadian dollars, from which they could buy the bins and other things. And they had meetings with the principal and others under with Rhonda. And so they were anointed and they were, as it were, given permission to do it. But they knew they had to take on talking to all the other students. And so they might have been given legitimacy by the school, Rhonda, etc., but they still had to win that legitimacy from the students themselves. But I think it did work in that way.
Yeah, I can see how it would work as well. I think, though, it probably began with themselves and their own sayings, doings, and relatings.
It did.
You know, and maybe the values they held as well, and what was important to them, what they perceived to be important for them in their lives. And I think maybe that's maybe the beginning before all of this.
Who knows where the beginning is, the chicken or the egg, Máirín? That lemniscate in the background there, that lemniscate in the background of that picture is trying to remind us that the practice architectures shape the practices and the practices shape the practice architectures. And it goes backwards and forwards, and that's happening all the time when we're just living, you know. So I think they are always interconnected. There isn't, one side is not where everything is initiated. I think you're right, it comes from both.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry for this this stairway that's distressing you as you see it. Here's the old picture from we were talking about last time about changing practices. So changing practices requires changing practice architectures. Changing practice architectures can be done partly through practices. So when you're doing an action research project, you're trying to see how those things change as you go along. And so you're trying to be thoughtful and, as you say, not perfectly in the order of this spiral, but you're trying to think about how this is going, the process of change. So if you think about a change like from group instruction to inquiry teaching, at the beginning, the sayings are dominated by teacher talk. And at the end, you're hoping that there'll be mostly student talk. But the things that are talked about in the cultural discursive arrangements are mostly the teacher's language and ideas. But you hope when you get going on this inquiry learning that the students' language and ideas will become more prominent. And so that it'll be what they're thinking is the main thing. The doings, teacher controlled, classroom talk and interaction at the beginning, but you want to get student talk, reflection, group discussion going. So the teacher might be at the front at the beginning, controlling the use of the space for everybody, but then you might have students grouped around tables or in a environmental science project going around the community out on some revegetation project or something. So the material economic arrangements are changing to make space for the student talk and reflection and so on. Similarly, to use the cliches, the teacher is the sage on the stage in the kind of group instruction, but hoping to be the guide on the side later on. So you're trying to change the social political arrangements of the classroom, which began with strong hierarchical teacher authority, but you're trying to change it to more collegial student-teacher relationships in which there's more space for the students to be doing talking and thinking. So on the practices side, the project of teaching is the teacher, for example, transmitting subject matter knowledge. But the project, after you get the inquiry teaching going, is teaching for individual and collective understanding. And you're trying to create conditions under which individual understandings are being collectively aired and thought about together. The kind of practice landscape is one of the teacher dominating the classroom to a different kind of practice landscape in which there are multiple teaching and learning practices going on in parallel, perhaps. So on the one side, the disposition to transmit knowledge, to the disposition to help students construct their own knowledge, and the practice tradition, the tradition of formal instruction, giving way perhaps to a more progressive constructivist tradition. But while you're doing those changes, if you're doing that planning, acting, observing, and reflecting, you're collecting data about the extent to which those things, the from things, are receding and the to things are becoming more prominent. And so you're trying to collect evidence to see that you are making a shift to inquiry teaching. In this case, for example, you were going to say something.
Yes, so I can see how in a teacher's classroom, if they're engaging in action research in their own practice and they're working towards going from group instruction to inquiry teaching, I can see how their practice architectures would be changed in their own classroom. But if we're to talk about a broader aspect, a broader perspective of practice architectures, is it more problematic?
Yes, it is indeed. As probably you have, worked in many schools and school districts and so on, where people have been making changes of these kinds, and they've had a great difficulty making changes because people around them think they shouldn't be doing whatever they're changing to. You're trying to do inquiry teaching. That's a very inefficient way of getting the physics curriculum in year 11 to the students. They should be sitting down and making notes in their books and getting the stuff off the blackboard or whatever. And so there are always contests about these changes with action research projects. And they can be controversial in a school. And so people need to work together. I think it's very useful to form groups, for teachers to form groups to explore changing things together in the education setting. And then it's interesting across schools, in clusters of schools, to do the same thing. But we've just had a brand new report come out in Australia about teacher education, in which a bunch of politicians are telling teachers that they're going to change the teacher education curriculum of the universities. They're going to change the professional standards for teachers, and they're going to change the accountability mechanisms to make sure everybody does what the politicians think they should be doing. The politicians, by the way, don't actually know what they're doing, either the teachers or the teacher educators. And many teacher educators are up in arms because these people are talking from a position of great ignorance, and they're putting in place very rigid systems that are likely to make things worse. And so they think they're operating off the basis of so-called, evidence-based practice, but they really don't know anything about the evidence or about the research. All they want to do is control so that their fear that things are going bad in teacher education and in teaching will be, their fear can be removed because everything will go right. But they don't actually know what they're doing. And so we have a terrible situation where people in university teacher education departments around the country are now holding their heads and saying, oh no, here we go again, more control, but no more permission for teachers to do well and to experiment and to find out how to do better. So these things are always contested at a big level. There isn't a magic wand where we can go ting and everything will go right. But hopefully we'll have a profession where people can talk about these things.
Yeah, and it makes the case, doesn't it, of how important it is for teachers to be researching their practice, really, doesn't it? And not only researching it, but sharing their findings of their research
absolutely,
and showing the significance of it and having it heard in public debate, at a national level.
As Lawrence Stenhouse used to say, research is inquiry made public, and it's the making public in a discourse community that allows this evidence to be tested among peers. And that's why I think that it's really, really important to have what Lawrence Stenhouse in the 1970s wanted, teachers who are extended professionals, teachers who are researchers into their own practice and exploring new possibilities within the profession. Coming to practice differently happens in all sorts of fields. We could be talking about the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. But in relation to renewable energy, for example, we're all across the whole globe going through a process which is essentially shifting from one way of using energy or one source of energy to another source of energy. And so our sayings and the cultural discursive arrangements are changing. Fossil fuels, the source of energy versus renewables. And we have all of these discourses about coal and oil and gas and so on, discourses about renewables and why renewables. We do things differently. Coal-fired power stations, solar, wind, tidal power. Grids distributing energy, currently linked up to coal, oil, gas, etc., now distributing energy from renewables. Changed relatings, using fossil fuels regardless of their harm to the planet, using renewables to protect the planet. And the social political arrangements, fossil fuel industry versus the renewable industry. And those changes we can see are being fought out in a place like the United States in very, very difficult political debates. In some parts of Europe, the arguments have been much more readily taken. The point of talking about this, the project of exploitative energy use, sustainable energy use, different practice landscapes and so on, is just to say, when you think about most big changes in the world, they involve changes in practices and practice architectures, sayings, doings, and relatings, and the arrangements that hold them in place. Go on, Máirín.
Yes, no, I'm just acknowledging to myself that I'm beginning to be convinced. Yeah. And, you know, so this slide, you know, is nearly related to the project slide you were looking at previously, the high school and the recycling, because obviously the themes are connected. And how, you know, maybe one child in a classroom can have an enormous, you know, in their own practice, can influence other practices and other practice architectures, which can have a global influence. And we're back to Greta Thunberg again.
Indeed. And what an extraordinary impact that has been. I mean, but she's speaking on behalf of her generation, but she's speaking things that scientists have been saying for years, and it's just absolutely overwhelming to see how well she's been able to do. My friends Christine Edwards-Groves and Christina Davidson have been doing work on dialogic pedagogies. It's a bit like the inquiry teaching slide we talked about earlier, but they're helping teachers through action research to change their ways of thinking about teaching, what they do in their teaching, the ways they relate in their teaching. And they're giving teachers changed ways of thinking about the nature of their work and the language understandings and so on. And so they wrote this book reporting on a big action research board, not a big action research project, an action research project they did with some groups of teachers, about 20 teachers in two groups, one in the country, one in the city. And they were working together in action research projects in their own classrooms and coming to group meetings to exchange their learnings about trying to introduce more dialogic pedagogies in their own classrooms. And so the book, Becoming a Meaning Maker, gives a bit of an introduction about children's talk and interaction. And then it introduces transcription. So if you videotape your talk and interaction in the classroom, you can transcribe interesting bits of the exchanges and see what goes on. But Christine and Christina taught these teachers, not a hard job, and they describe it in Becoming a Meaning Maker, how to do Jeffersonian notation, Jeffersonian transcriptions of bits of classroom interaction, how you write the pauses, how you write the changing tone and all that sort of stuff. Teachers all managed to make the changes. No, it's not, it wasn't a big deal. And then they started analysing what was going on. So they came along with bits, 2-minute bits of classroom talk and interaction that they'd videotaped with transcripts of the bits to show what was going on in those bits. And so they then were trying to change their ways of working as teachers to increase student-to-student talk and interaction and less of the so-called IRF, the initiation, response, feedback cycle, which runs radially around the teacher. The teacher talks, then the students are allowed to respond to a question or whatever, and then the teacher gives feedback. So the teacher controls all of the interaction in that IRF framework. So they taught the teacher to think about listening, to listen more to what the students say, to work out cleverer ways to respond to them. And out of those cleverer ways, they start developing understanding of what they call questioning moves. What sort of moves can you make when a student talks to get the students to talk? Why do you say that, Jenny? What do you think about that, Johnny? When you open up the floor, you can create much more space for student talk. So they began to think about these talk moves, questioning moves that created more space for the students to learn. They dealt with agreeing and disagreeing, but then they noticed that through all of this, they were able to get the students themselves to talk about talk and interaction in the classroom. So they could talk about talk. They could talk about the ways people talked and the ways people participated in lessons. And then they come to the conclusion about making meaning in the dialogic classroom. But these two groups of teachers, within a year, in 9 months or something like that, made quite dramatic changes to their own teaching to do different kinds of talk, different kinds of work, different kinds of relatings, as did the students. And they were changing not only how they thought about what was going on, now we want to have a dialogic classroom, they changed the way they did classroom talk and interaction, and they changed, very importantly, the social relationships in order that the students could learn more, as it were, for themselves. I remember years ago, we used to talk about who talks mathematics in the mathematics classroom. Answer the teacher. And to get the students to talk maths in the mathematics classroom was sort of, in those days, a new thing. The topic for this session was action research and the theory of practice architectures. I now look with some regret at the picture of the spiral staircase. But you get the idea that we're trying to be self-reflective and to keep reflecting and keep collecting evidence about how things are going, so that we can see that we're making progress in changing how we understand what we're doing, the nature of the work and the resources we use. We're changing the social relationships between people so that people can say things, do things, and relate to one another in the world differently through doing that action research project.
Yeah, I can see how using practice architectures could enable us to engage in an action research that can bring around change, sustainable change as well. You've been very persuasive, Stephen, I must say.
One of the things that I failed to do, Máirín, was to talk about the middle of that table. The languages we use inform what we say, orient what we say, justify what we say. If you're a teacher, why are you saying what you say? Why are you doing what you do? The work and activities and the materials you use supply and support and sustain what you do. What tools do you need to do the job? How do you need to organize the classroom for dialogic pedagogy or inquiry teaching? And the changed social relationships, you want to be able to nurture and orchestrate and maintain different ways people relate to each other. And so I think that when we think about the things on the practice architecture side of this diagram, they're, if you like, the resources or the content of the sayings, doings, and relatings that are on the right. And you want to change those resources or that content on the left to make different things possible. Now, in another session, it would be interesting to see if there were any cases where when people made a change, especially a sustainable change in their teaching, whether they failed to do any of those things on the left. Because I think you can't make a sustainable change without doing all of those things on the left. So you were doubtful at the beginning and you feel a bit more persuaded now. But my strong claim would be you can't change the sayings, doings, and relatings of people's practices without changing those arrangements on the left-hand side, those practice architectures.
Yes. But you know what? I think you need a third category or something, because in this episode, you have changed the location of your practice architectures. You've swapped it with your practices column.
Yes, indeed.
Very sneakily, I may comment. But, so when I was looking at the practices, I was thinking about my own sayings, doings, and relatings as a teacher. And I was looking at the changed practice architectures and, saying, well, maybe the practice architectures within my classroom, I might be able to change those. I might be able to change them maybe in a class, in a school level. It depends on what is happening. But when you turn it around, then I think you're talking more about the significance of if you're doing action research, the significance of doing your research and the influence it has on others. And you begin to talk about the changed language and discourses in your school, perhaps, or even your school region, if that, that is your aim, that you're working outwards.
Indeed. Next time, Máirín, I'm hoping we're going to be talking about tensions and contradictions between education and schooling. We've been talking about education a lot, of course. That's mostly where I work. But a whole lot of the material that we've been looking at so far is about social life in general and social practice in general, not just about social life in schools and classrooms. But when we come to episode 10, I'm wanting to focus more squarely on the tensions and contradictions between the practice of education and the institutions of schooling.
Good, and that's a good follow-on to this one. Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, for helping us to understand the connection between action research and the theory of practice architectures. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for episode 9 of Researching Practice, Introducing the Theory of Practice Architectures podcast with Stephen Kemmis and me, Máirín Glenn. And as Stephen has outlined, episode 10 is entitled Tensions and Contradictions Between Education and Schooling, which is a very intriguing title. You may access these podcasts via YouTube on the link below or at stephenkemmis.com or at eari.ie. Looking forward to seeing you the next time. Bye from me.
Bye from me.